From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm Daniel Boomhower, the head of Reader Services in the library's music division. It's a wonderful opportunity that we have today to hear Johann Sebastian Bach's complete cello suites in the course of an afternoon. These deserve and have received much attention in scholarly and popular literature, but in the midst of this marathon performance, dwelling too much on the minutiae of these compositions may test the endurance of even the most ardent audience. There's no need to make this into an epic of Wagnerian proportion. Instead, I'd like to step back from the cello suites themselves, seeking to consider them in a broader context and in relation to the holdings of the Library of Congress. When asked to think of a creative title for this talk, I proposed The Many Rooms of Bach's Suite. There are many suites composed by Bach for a variety of instruments, over 50 different suites or partitas for harpsichord, lute, violin, flute, cello, and ensemble, all consisting of movements patterned after well-established dance styles, such as allemands, courants, sarabands, minuets, and gigues. The suites by Bach include the so-called French and English suites, and the partitas for harpsichord and solo violin. When viewed in relation to Bach's compositional output, one becomes aware that these suites most likely served an essentially domestic function. With the exception of his organ music and sacred vocal music, we cannot say for certain what music Bach performed publicly. We do know that Bach, for a number of years, directed performances of the Collegium Musicum in Leipzig, which performed in Zimmermann's Coffee House. What music the Collegium Musicum performed is not conclusively documented, though we can confidently say that most of Bach's concertos would have been heard in this setting, as would have other ensemble pieces and possibly vocal works. We can also say confidently that the performing conditions in a coffee house of Bach's day little resemble what we find in modern concerts. Anachronistic, though it certainly is, it might be useful to think of a setting like a modern-day Starbucks with an unamplified group playing while numerous other conversations and activities are taking place. While the suites for solo instruments could very well have been played in this kind of setting, the rapt attention they receive in public performance today is very much a modern phenomenon. However, in the Bach household, that is to say, in the living suite of Bach, the musical suites would likely have received much more attentive consideration. The cello suites do not survive in Bach's handwriting. The most authoritative source that survives is in the hand of his second wife, Anna Magdalena Bach, and the likely first owner of this manuscript was a student of Bach's by the name of Heinrich Ludwig Schwanberg. This is what the manuscript looks like in Anna Magdalena Bach's hand. The connection of this manuscript with Bach's family and a student brings to the fore the issue on which I will focus in this brief talk. The library does not own any primary sources for the cello suites. However, we do have in our collection another manuscript of other suites by Bach that also highlights the close connection between family and students. This is one of a few objects that I wish to highlight and discuss today. But before describing this manuscript, we should consider the living and working conditions of German musicians in the late 17th and early 18th century. Johann Sebastian Bach's father, Johann Ambrosius Bach, was the director of the town musicians in the central German city of Eisenach, where Johann Sebastian was born, and which is also famous as the location of the Wartburg, where Martin Luther had sought refuge during the Reformation. Johann Ambrosius Bach, as a master musician and a member of a renowned extended family of musicians, also housed and trained a number of apprentices and journeyman musicians, as most musicians of the era functioned within the time-honored structure of the guild system that regulated most trades. While both of Johann Sebastian's parents had died by early 1695, before he turned 10 years old, the master-apprentice relationship continued to inform Bach's life as a musician. Following his father's death, the youngest child, Johann Sebastian, and his next oldest brother, Johann Jakob, moved in with their oldest sibling, Johann Christoph, who had recently married and been appointed organist at St. Michael's Church in the nearby town of Ohrdruf. I'm going to show you a map. If it comes up. So this is central Germany. The German name of the region is Thüringen. In English, they've mangled it to be Thuringia. You can see the dot, or the pin here is Ohrdruf. Here is Eisenach, and if we zoom out, you can start to get a sense of where this is in relation to other places in Germany. Leipzig is here, Berlin is here, and if we scroll down, the North Sea and Lübeck, the peninsula on which Denmark is located. So Johann Sebastian Bach and his next older brother had moved in with their eldest brother, Johann Christoph, who had completed an apprenticeship with the preeminent organist in Thüringen, Johann Pachelbel. During the 5 years that he lived with his brother, Johann Sebastian would develop a fuller understanding of the professional life of a musician and would study music formally under his brother. Another object from the library's collection that I wish to describe for you is a volume of a music journal published by one of Bach's many students, Lorenz Christoph Mitzler. Now, before you protest, I do acknowledge that I have yet to talk about collection item number 1, the manuscript of Bach's suites. We'll get to that shortly. In Mitzler's journal, which was titled Neu eröffnete musikalische Bibliothek, the newly opened musical library, later called Lorenz Mitzler's Musikalische Bibliothek, we find an obituary for Bach written by his son Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach and another student, Johann Friedrich Agricola, written shortly after the composer's death in 1750, but not published until 1754. Mike, can we cut the stage? This is the obituary, the first page, and it's from a copy that we have of the entire. There are 4 volumes of the Mitzler's journal that were published, and the library has the privilege of housing all 4 copies of all four volumes. The obituary appeared in the very last issue of the journal, and is the source of much of the information we have on Bach's life. In it is related a very curious story, which must have been related to Carl Philipp Emanuel and possibly Agricola by Bach himself. It says, Johann Sebastian was not 10 years old when he found himself bereft of his parents by death. He betook himself to Ohrdruf, where his eldest brother, Johann Christoph, was organist, and under this brother's guidance, he laid the foundations for his playing of the clavier. The love of our little Johann Sebastian for music was uncommonly great, even at this tender age. In a short time, he had fully mastered all the pieces his brother had voluntarily given to him to learn. But his brother possessed a book of clavier pieces by the most famous masters of the day, Froberger, Carol, Pachelbel. And this, despite all his pleading, and for who knows what reason, was denied him. His zeal to improve himself thereupon gave him the idea of practicing the following innocent deceit. This book was kept in a cabinet whose doors consisted only of grill work. Now, with his little hand, he could reach through the grill work and roll the book up for it had only a paper cover. Accordingly, he would fetch the book out at night when everyone had gone to bed, and since he was not even possessed of a light, copy it by moonlight. In 6 months' time, he had these musical spoils in his own hands. Secretly and with extraordinary eagerness, he was trying to put it to use when his brother, to his great dismay, found out about it, and without mercy took away from him the copy he had made with such pains. We may gain a good idea of our little Johann Sebastian's sorrow over this loss by imagining a miser whose ship sailing for Peru, I'm not making any of this up. We may gain a good idea of our little Johann Sebastian's sorrow over this loss by imagining a miser whose ship sailing for Peru has foundered with its cargo of 100,000 thaler. One of the time-honored mechanisms by which music was taught was through copying of scores by hand. As notated music was one of the essential tools of a professional musician's livelihood, access to notated music was carefully guarded, a fact that should be appreciated when contemplating the curious story of the young Johann Sebastian copying out music from his brother's collection. Johann Sebastian, in fact, perpetuated this practice of carefully managing the music available to a student, as documented in the famous Klavierbuchlein for Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, held in Yale University's music library, and in the many copies of the Well-Tempered Clavier that survive in numerous versions copied by many of Bach's students. A commonplace book similar to the Klavierbuchlein is held at the Princeton University Library and contains the curriculum followed by Bach's student Heinrich Nicholas Gerber. Another similar item is held here at the library, and it demonstrates that this practice was continued by Bach's students. Here's the Klavierbuchlein. This slide, seen here in this slide, is an explanation from the Klavierbuchlein for Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, and it's an explanation of clefs, such as the bass clef, or F clef, and the treble clef, or the G clef, but especially C clefs, which were most prominently used or predominantly used at that time. This slide is from a commonplace book that's held here at the Library of Congress. It's in the hand of a student of a musician by the name of Johann Christian Kittel. Kittel was one of Bach's very last students, and as we can see in this, we have a very similar kind of explanation of clefs to that which is found in the Klavierbuchlein for Wilhelm Friedemann Bach. This slide shows the guide to ornaments in Wilhelm Friedemann's book, while this slide shows a similar guide in the Kittel book, each of them explaining what a mordant and a trill, or a trill with a mordant, or a cadence or a double cadence is and how it is notated. Agricola, the co-author of the obituary, Mitzler, the publisher of the journal in which the obituary appeared, Gerber, and Kittel all studied with Bach while students at the University of Leipzig, the city in which Bach, from 1723 to 1750, taught at the St. Thomas School and held responsibility for the music in the city's 4 main churches. Bach, throughout his professional life, had many students, some of whom would have resided with his family and would have assisted with or assumed some of the responsibilities assigned to Bach in his various positions, all in keeping with the norms of the guild system. While most of Bach's private students in Leipzig were students at the university and therefore more independent, the closeness of the students with the Bach family is demonstrated by the surviving manuscript of the cello suites in Anna Magdalena Bach's hand, and which belonged early on to a student. This is also documented in one of the gems of the Bach holdings here at the Library of Congress, a manuscript copy of the keyboard compositions we know as the French suites. This slide, or this manuscript, is in the hand of Bach's student Johann Christoph Altnickel, who studied at the university from 1744 to 1747, and in September of 1748 assumed the position of organist at St. Wenzel's Church in Naumburg. on the 20th of January, 1749, he married Bach's daughter, Elisabeth Juliana Friederike. The primary source for the French suites, which are keyboard suites, survives in one of the two other famous clavier Buchlines, those for Anna Magdalena Bach. 5 of the French suites are found in the manuscript dated 1722 in the hand of Johann Sebastian Bach, which is preserved at the Staatsbibliothek zu Berlin. The first and part of the second suites are also found in the 1725 clavier Buchlein for Anna Magdalena Bach, copied out mostly in her hand. The first section of the 1725 clavier Buchlein for Anna Magdalena Bach contains 2 of the partitas which would later be printed in the first clavier Übung. That was one of the first collections of pieces by Bach that were printed in his lifetime. There were a total of 8 pieces of his music that were published in his lifetime in printed editions, minus 2 cantatas at the beginning of his life. So really 10. This is what the first French suite looks like in the 1725 clavier Buchlein for Anna Magdalena Bach. The first section, like I said, contained the clavier Übung, the partitas, and then Anna Magdalena determined the contents of the rest of the volume. In it are found a variety of lighter pieces, such as minuets, polonaises, and marches, compositions by the older Bach children, and compositional attempts by the younger Bach children. There are also copies of compositions by some of the many visitors in the Bach household, such as the Dresden court organist Christian Petzold, and 2 polonaises by the famous Dresden Kapellmeister Johann Adolf Hasse. There are also songs that Anna Magdalena might have sung at home, having formerly been a court singer in Köthen. In addition, there are harmony and thorough bass exercises for the Bach children. As the Bach scholar Georg von Dodelsen has written about the 1725 clavier Übung, in short, the whole Bach family is united here in this little book. It is first and foremost the visual perception of the numerous handwritings of father, wife, stepsons, and sons in the clavier Buchlein, which allows us to penetrate into the everyday world of the Thomas Cantor. With that in mind, let's consider for a moment what Bach's living quarters or suite looked like, at least in Leipzig. In 1732, the St. Thomas School building, which included the Cantor's residence, was renovated. Numerous images of the building survive, as do some architectural drawings. This is an early 19th century image of the same building. These images depict the courtyard of the church being on the right-hand side or north side, and the school is at the center on the west side of the courtyard. The Cantor's residence consisted of the rooms, I'm going to go back to the previous slide. The Cantor's residence consisted of the rooms on the first 4 floors on the south side or left side of the building, extending the width of the first 2 windows. Each floor consisted of 2 to 4 rooms. As you can see in this diagram, they're of the first 2 floors. So the Cantor's residence, if you look on the very left-hand side, the ground level is the bottom portion of this. You can see an entryway here, staircase, and then these rooms for the Cantor's residence, and they would have extended 4 floors. This was the composing, like the study of Bach. This was the school library, and then this was a classroom. It was in these spaces that Johann Christoph Altnickel would have become acquainted with Elisabeth Juliana Friederike, or Lieschen, Bach's 11th child, the 6th to survive to adulthood and the 3rd born to Anna Magdalena. It is also in these rooms that Altnickel would have come to know Bach's music intimately and would have been entrusted with the privilege of copying his music. The care with which this manuscript is copied suggests the great esteem in which the music was held by the copyist, and perhaps his fondness for its associations with his teacher, his wife, and her family. Not many images survive of Bach, which has prompted many artists after his lifetime to create fanciful depictions of what he might have looked like and what his life might have been like, including this late 19th century depiction of the Bach family together. I did say fanciful. In the display case in the foyer of the Coolidge Auditorium, you will find, these are on in the two display cases closest to the auditorium. You will find the alt-nickel copy of the French suites, along with a facsimile of the 1725 clavier Buchlein for Anna Magdalena Bach. And also, that's in the case on the south side. And in the north case is the Kittel Commonplace book, along with a facsimile of the clavier Buchlein for Wilhelm Friedemann Bach. And an original edition of Lawrence Mitzler's journal with the obituary is also on display. Before I finish, let's listen to the opening of the French suites, the Allemande from the suite in D minor, played here by David Moroni. I'm sure you will enjoy the continuation of Tanya Tompkins' performance of the cello suites, and I would be happy to answer any questions you might have. Yes?
Since we don't have
Jay's going to hand you a microphone.
Since we don't have any cello suites in Bach's own,
Right hand.
do we have any pieces where we have, say, Anna Magdalena's version and Bach's version, so we can see
yes.
what kind of changes she made, or was she faithful?
That's an excellent question. We do, noteworthy example is of the sonatas and partitas for solo violin, where we have a copy in Bach's hand, which has been reproduced in published facsimiles endlessly. And then there's also a copy in Anna Magdalena's hand. And they're essentially, she was a very faithful copyist. By comparison, if one takes into account the many, many dozens of copies of the Preludes and Fugues of both books of the Well-Tempered Clavier, you have endless variations, where we have autograph sources and then we have student sources. And what's interesting is you can see compositional changes that aren't reflected in the autograph in Bach's hand, but are extremely plausible and sometimes better. And the inclination is to attribute the improvements to J.S. Bach, but because we don't have, in some instances, sources that document that change in Bach's hand, it could, in fact, be students. One thing that's worth noting is that Bach used and reused music endlessly and had no problem changing it to suit different purposes. Other questions?
Was it
He certainly made them very popular. I don't really know the violin sonatas and partitas for solo violin were played extensively in the 19th century, and on occasion had accompaniments written for them by Schumann and Mendelssohn, but we don't have instances, as prominent of instances with the cello suites. But like I said, I don't know the reception of the cello suites terribly well, but Casals certainly did popularize them. But there are other authorities who might speak to that.
Did all that come on the heels of Mendelssohn with the B minor Mass, or St. Matthew Passion when he discovered and had that performed?
Did all of that.
The finding of, rediscovering of Bach's other work?
So in the 18th century, Bach's music was still, there was a continuous line of Bach reception. So the idea of Mendelssohn rediscovering Bach's music with his performance in 1829 of the St. Matthew Passion with the Berliner Sing Academy is something of a myth. It was really a popular rediscovery, kind of in the way that Casals' performances of the cello suites is sort of, they were known, they just came to popular attention. What's interesting about, or an interesting facet of Mendelssohn's performance of the St. Matthew Passion in 1829, which he believed was exactly 100 years after his original performance, which it wasn't, it was 102 years after its original performance, was that it was very much wrapped up in German nationalism. And so it was the German people rediscovering Bach that the myth should properly be kind of, that's the idea. But Bach's music was, there were about, by 1829, for instance, there were over 40 manuscript copies of the B minor Mass in circulation, but which is a small number by and large, but it had fairly wide distribution. So Charles Burney in England had a copy of the Credo from the B minor Mass. There were several copies of the B minor Mass in Vienna, including one that was owned by Joseph Haydn, and that connection or that Viennese presence of the B minor Mass allows the sort of comparison of Beethoven's Missa Solemnis to the B minor Mass as being very plausible. So Bach's music was known, but it was known more by musicians than by the general public.
Was the Mendelssohn performance the most popular of its time?
Well, it was the beginning, and it hasn't stopped. Yes?
Is it true that Bach fell so far out of favor that many of the cantata scores were lost because people thought they'd rather use it for scrap paper?
That's open to question. I don't believe that's entirely true. There were three main kind of groups of cantatas. When he began his position in Leipzig in 1723, he was writing essentially a cantata a week for almost 3 years. He had written about half a year's worth, I believe, prior to that. But every week, every Sunday, there was a new cantata beginning in 1723. So if you think about, in the obituary, it's stated that there are 5 complete cycles of Bach cantatas, cycles, a cantata for each Sunday of the liturgical year. By that estimation, we're missing a lot. but there, we have firm, conclusive documentation of 3 cycles, and then scatterings from earlier in his life and later in his life. But the cantatas were essentially divided up. There was a manuscript score and then copyist parts for each cantata. So Bach would write the cantata, and then students would copy out the performing parts. So the violin part, the viola part, the continuo part, each voice part. And those were distributed primarily to Wilhelm Friedemann, the oldest son, Carl Philipp, the second oldest son, and a set of the performing parts was also given to Anna Magdalena. Those survived largely intact, that set of performing parts for the second Jahrgang cycle, and those are preserved in Leipzig. She sold them to the St. Thomas not long after Bach's death. Carl Philipp, he had a very financially sound existence throughout his career, and he was able to preserve all of the Nachlass, his inheritance from his father, fairly well intact. Wilhelm Friedemann had the misfortune, whereas Carl Philipp Emanuel had the benefit of living in Prussia, Wilhelm Friedemann had the misfortune of living in Saxony, which was Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia's arch nemesis. So in the 7 Years' War, Frederick the Great did a number on Saxony. And if you're on the losing side of a war, the economy is not great. And so that affects, as we kind of have become familiar, it affects every portion of life. And so it's reasonable, that Wilhelm Friedemann has been maligned for having squandered his inheritance by selling it off piecemeal. One of the nice things about that is that the Library of Congress was able to acquire 2 of those cantata manuscripts that had formerly belonged to Wilhelm Friedemann. But it opens to question the possibility that a lot that had belonged to Wilhelm Friedemann had been lost. But there were numerous collectors in the late 18th century, early 19th century, who were able to round up a lot of the manuscripts, especially a guy by the name of Georg Pulkow, who is associated with the Berlin Sing Academy. And Pulkow's collection and similar collections were bought or given to the Prussian State Library in the early 19th century. So yes, we're missing cantatas. What we're missing more of are, one suspects, are materials from Weimar, where Bach's first position at a court was in Weimar from 1707 to 1714, I believe. And then after Weimar, he went to Köthen, and then Köthen to Leipzig. Because Bach, these are all what we would call today works for hire, the music belonged to the court. The castle burned to the ground in the 1770s and everything in it. So all of the music of Bach's colleagues is completely missing. But we suspect that a lot of music from the Weimar period was recycled. So it's found in later cantatas or in instrumental pieces, concertos, things like that. But it's anyone's guess how much is missing.
I wanted to kind of take up that question of missing Bach manuscripts, which you've...
Do you have one in your attic?
Well, we even to this day, we hear about a lost one being found, Bach, Mozart,
yeah.
I think it was a Brahms one earlier this year.
Yep.
It may be impossible to predict, but do you think we will keep turning up lost Bach manuscripts in the next several years?
It's plausible. The 2 manuscripts have been discovered recently, within the last, I'd say, 5 years. One was an organ manuscript in tablature, which is this really arcane way of writing out music. It's the best analog is to think of guitar tablature today. It's more of a graphical, as if a score is not graphical, but it's like tells you where to put your fingers. I can't read it to save myself. But an early tablature book in Bach's hand was discovered not too long ago, and it's the earliest manuscript in Bach's hand that survives. And then a strophic aria was discovered in Weimar recently as well. The new sources, or sources that were known but have kind of disappeared, their traces disappeared, are likely to be rediscovered, I think. Autographed manuscripts, I suspect those are going to be fewer and further between. But if you find one, let us know. Well, like I said, enjoy the rest of the concert.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.